Welcome to Faith and Freedom. For the next few minutes, we hope to inform, inspire, and encourage you as we discuss the legal victories and challenges to your fundamental freedoms and religious liberties. Faith and Freedom comes to you from Liberty Counsel, a civil liberties education and legal defense organization. Join us now as Matt Staver, the President and General Counsel of Liberty Counsel, explains the latest legal issues all across this country. In the courtrooms of America, Liberty Counsel is winning the battle for your constitutional freedoms.
The United Nations has become the theater of the absurd. I am Matt Staver, founder and chairman of Liberty Counsel. Joining me today is Shawn Akers, vice president of Middle Eastern Affairs for Liberty Counsel. We're going to be talking about the United Nations and Israel as it pertains to the recent request by Mahmoud Abbas, the leader of the Palestinian Authority, to have the PA recognized as a nation state within the United Nations. And Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel gave this message before the United Nations during that week of deliberation where they were meeting in New York, and he called the United Nations the theater of the absurd. I love his directness. I love how he is strong in his position and unwavering on these fundamental principles.
You know, Matt, it's a breath of fresh air to see him come out and call things what they are. The fact is, no nation in history has ever faced more illogical opposition than the State of Israel. It doesn't make any sense in any logical aspect. What you have here is the nation of Israel being bullied, quite frankly, from almost every direction. If you've ever seen them pull up a map of the State of Israel, there where it sits on the Mediterranean Sea, and you see all the opposition, huge countries of opposition that surround it from every side, and now you've got this push for unilateral statehood by the Palestinians, and it really is exactly what he said. It's theater of the absurd.
Well, let's look at Mahmoud Abbas, first of all. Look at his background. His other name, he goes by two different names. Mahmoud Abbas is what people commonly know him by now, but his other name is Abu Mazen. And that was the name he used when he studied and obtained his doctoral dissertation, and he prepared his doctoral dissertation, and it was regarding the Israel, the Jewish history during the Nazi Holocaust. He is a Holocaust denier. This individual, you hear about Ahmadinejad, the president of Iran, being a Holocaust denier. Well, this Mahmoud Abbas, Abu Mazen, who is the head of the Palestinian Authority, is also a Holocaust denier. Like Ahmadinejad in Iran, Abbas in the Palestinian Authority, if you deny that the Holocaust actually exists, then you will likely be somebody who would be in favor of a new Holocaust. And obviously that's why the Palestinian Authority leader will not recognize Israel's right to exist, which is a fundamental basis on which any negotiation has to be rested on. If you don't recognize that, then dispute over land is irrelevant.
You know, Matt, it was prior to Yasser Arafat, even the Arab leaders there, the Palestinian tour guides and that kind of thing, would recognize certain parts of Israel and its Jewish heritage. After that, you saw two forms of denial that came up. One came out of something called the Copenhagen School, and it's temple denial. The other was Holocaust denial. And when you combine those two, it was a form of Palestinian and larger Muslim historical revisionism on a grand scale to completely rewrite the history of Israel and the Jewish people. And it included two basic things. One is saying that there was no Holocaust, and the other is saying that everything that you say is the temple or has something to do with the temple in Jerusalem or any claim of Jewish right historically to the land of Israel is being replaced by another pretextual narrative. And that's taken place now since the time of Yasser Arafat, and Abu Mazen is, make no mistake about it, is a leader in those lines of thought.
He really is. Well, he is asking that the United Nations recognize the Palestinian Authority for statehood or nation-state status within the United Nations. And he is looking at several geographical locations within Israel. The Gaza Strip, which is on the Mediterranean Sea towards the south. The so-called Golan Heights, which is in the north, and the so-called West Bank, which is on the west. Now, the West Bank is better known as Judea-Samaria. We commonly refer to it as the West Bank. It really is the Judea-Samaria. This is where the prophet Amos lived, in those areas, and where he actually gave a prophecy that the people of Israel would return to that area and actually grow vegetables and fruit and grow vineyards. And in fact, several hundred thousand Israelis live in that area. Several hundred thousand Jews, they live there. They also live in the Golan Heights in the north. So he's wanting those areas to be part of the Palestinian state. Well, that is back to the so-called 67 borders. That would make Israel 9 miles wide at its center. But more importantly, for statehood purposes, the basic bottom line, the first element that you would need if you're going to be asking the United Nations to recognize you as an independent nation is that you control the land. United Nations can't just ipsy-dixit just give you land that you don't control. Well, the Palestinian Authority doesn't control this land. It is controlled and it is secured by Israel, not Palestinian Authority officials. So how can the PA ask for it to be recognized as a nation state over land which it does not control and which it does not give security for? In fact, where indeed the Israelis give security and control those portions of the land of Israel.
No, and that's part of the reason that this is so attractive to groups like the United Nations. It's only a unifying force like Israel that would give the United Nations this so cultivated status, this so sought-after status of super sovereignty, where the United Nations, in essence, would act as the granting power here to create a state ex nihilo, out of nothing. There's no state there, but the United Nations would choose to create one. And it ignores the realities on the ground, Matt. So much has changed. Even if there was some arguable way to make it secure, the fact is that the populations have shifted and the infrastructure has shifted. So much has moved since 1967. Those borders simply don't make any logistical sense.
Now, and if you go back, maybe tomorrow we can talk a little bit about those borders in 1967, because I think it's important for people to visualize and understand what we're talking about there. So I'll hold that conversation for later in the week. But Mahmoud Abbas, presenting this petition, wants the UN, like you're saying, to just create a state out of nothing that doesn't really exist, a state over territory that entity does not control. Now, in his speech, the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, called the United Nations the theater of the absurd, not only for that, but for also this history here. In fact, he specifically pointed out that Muammar Gaddafi's Libya once chaired the UN Commission on Human Rights. Libya chaired the Commission on Human Rights. And Saddam Hussein's Iraq headed the UN Committee on Disarmament. I mean, this is absolutely the absurd. Today, the Hezbollah-controlled Lebanon presides over the UN Security Council, resulting in a terrorist organization presiding over a body that is tasked with keeping the world safe. No wonder the Prime Minister of Israel called the United Nations the theater of the absurd.
You know, Matt, I don't want to over-exaggerate here or to exaggerate in any means the UN's reach, but the fact is Israel has been the sport of the UN since in time since recent memory. It's one of those things that if the UN can't think of anything else to do today, it's going to pass a resolution or attempt to pass a resolution against Israel. It's by all evidence, it's largely an anti-Semitic makeup of the UN, and you see that coming out now in the largest possible way.
You do, and I think right now it's so critical to stand with Israel. Tomorrow we'll talk about, and throughout this week, we'll talk about the 67 borders. What are they, and what's the implication of going back to the 67 borders? We'll also talk about the implication of the UN Security Council vote versus the UN General Assembly vote, the vote of the entire body versus the vote by the Security Council. And this issue regarding Palestinian statehood is now in front of the UN Security Council. They're going through deliberations on that, and they're going to determine whether or not they even bring it up for a vote. We're going to be talking about the implications of a vote at each level, and they are significant. Literally, they could be potentially the precipitating factor of the World War III. I mean, it is that significant in terms of what's at stake in this UN vote.
It is. In fact, Matt, there are very few things that you can think of that would lead to a worldwide conflict. But you see the whole globe taking sides on this issue. It's exactly what was prophesied biblically, that the nations of the world would gather around Israel and that people would have to choose sides. It's time for us to make a right decision.
That's right. It's time for America to have leadership. We currently fund the UN by more than $7 billion per year, and we need to have strong leadership. At Liberty Counsel, we have a Stand with Israel bumper sticker that we encourage you to display. You can get that by calling Liberty Counsel at 1-800-671-1776. You can go to our website and order that as well, Stand with Israel. We also have an open letter to both our government leaders here in America and also to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, which specifically states that we are standing with Israel and we are urging that America and the UN do the right thing, and that is not short-circuit the peace process and not unilaterally, out of its own thin cloth, grant the Palestinian Authority statehood.
You have been listening to Matt Staver of Liberty Counsel. Our hope is to encourage and inspire you to stand up for your faith, family, and freedoms. We can accomplish a lot when we work together. Get informed and get involved today. Sign up for our free monthly newsletter, The Liberator. We will send it out to you free of charge. Stay informed with our Liberty Alert email update. Just click on the website at www.lc.org or call us at 1-800-671-1776. Tune in next time to learn more about your rights right here on Faith and Freedom.